Hello, this is Paul Connett. This was meant to be the beginning of a month's tour of Australia, and I was going to be speaking something like 23 times. Unfortunately, the virus has had other ideas, and many of our presentations have been cancelled. The venues have been phoned us up and cancelled. So in lieu of these presentations, we're going to make a videotape, or rather, we made a videotape a few days ago in Perth in the public library. But we are missing the opening of that videotape, so I'm going to record that now and we'll splice the two together. Maybe we'll add some extra footage from Bunbury, where I spoke last night. I myself have to go back to the United States fairly quickly. But here we go. Now, my talk is on the neurotoxicity of fluoride. And dramatic things have changed. The whole fluoridation debate essentially changed on September the 19th, 2017, with the publication of this mother-offspring study in Mexico City. More about that in a moment. Since that study, there have been 5 or 6 more major studies, and they have taken into account all the reasons that the people promoting fluoridation had used for dismissing this issue. Oh, these studies were done in China or India, they don't count. Oh, these studies were done at high concentrations. These studies were not done at the concentrations at which we fluoridate in Australia, New Zealand, England, depending upon where the promoters were. All those quibbles have been dealt with in these 6 studies. This debate has been dramatically changed. Now, I've called my speech "The Neurotoxicity of Fluoride, Science versus Denial." It's largely aimed at science and scientists. We need scientists getting involved. We need scientists who understand this literature to take this out of the hands of propagandists. So the subtitle is Science versus Denial. I'll give you a lot of science, a little bit of history, and much of that history pertains to the denial. And in Australia, we're talking about the NHMRC, the National Health and Medical Research Council, continues to deny or continues to claim the perfect safety of fluoridation. So, first of all, I should acknowledge that this trip has been organized by Fluoride Free Australia. You can go to their website, fluoridefreeaustralia.org. It's an excellent website. They've linked to much of the information on our website in the United States, the fan website, fluoridealert.org. Some of you may have already seen the 15-second ads they've been running on television in the Perth area. I hope that they will run in other states in Australia. Now, I have melded my presentation, which is largely aimed towards the public, with a presentation put together by our science director, Chris Neurath. His presentation is called The Scientific Evidence for Fluoride's Developmental Neurotoxicity. Now, here's a picture. You can see Chris. Chris is in the blue shirt, standing in front of the United States Environmental Protection Agency, and to his right is Bill Hersey, former senior scientist at the EPA, who headed up a union there representing the professionals at the EPA who came out against the practice of water fluoridation when they studied the science. There I am on the other side of the picture. I think the same jacket, the same tie, same shirt. And next to me is a very important gentleman. That's Guanyong Zhang. As far as myself is concerned, I'm a retired professor of chemistry, and I specialized in environmental chemistry and toxicology. And this is really, I wear 2 hats as an activist, as a scientific activist. For one hat, I get a lot of respect, and in the other hat, I get a lot of derision. But I am an activist on waste management. I oppose incineration and promote sustainable alternatives, the zero waste strategy in the community interest. I am a consultant in the community interest. I do not get paid for this work by communities. And my second hat is fighting fluoridation, and that is where, of course, I pick up the derision. But I'm the same scientist and express the same and based upon the same concerns in toxicology and based upon the same integrity of telling the truth. Without truth, there is no science. So I've spent the last 24 years pursuing this matter. And when I first got involved in 1996, it coincided with two important events. One, in 1995, just 1 year before, Phyllis Mullinex at the Forsyth Dental Center in Boston produced an animal study which showed that animals exposed to fluoride before they were born were hyperactive, and animals exposed after they were born were hyperactive. She applied a new technique with video cameras and computers analyzing the movements of the animals side by side, those exposed, those non-exposed, and a novel technique. And Forsyth wanted her to look at the neurological impacts of the chemicals that they used in dentistry. And the first one she looked at was fluoride, and to her surprise, she wasn't expecting to find anything, but sure enough, the behavior of these animals was changed by exposure to fluoride. Rather than celebrating this important work, the Forsyth Dental Center fired her, told her that her work was no longer relevant to dentistry. Extraordinary. And poor Phyllis has not been employed in academia since. And you can imagine the terrible shockwave that went through the circles of scientific researchers. They were essentially being told, don't look at fluoride, because if you find the wrong thing, you could lose your job, you could lose your funding, etc., etc., etc. That, thank goodness, is now changing, but more about that later. And then in 1996, in 95 and 96, we got the first two IQ studies from China published in English. Subsequently, we found that there were other studies published before then, going back to 1989. But these were the first two that were available in English. And that was very, very important. And I was very struck at the time that why on earth, if fluoride could potentially lower the IQ of children, how could that notion be subservient to the notion that you need children exposed to fluoride to lower a little bit of tooth decay? But we're still in the history here. Now, catching up to the present, as of 2020, there have now been 72 fluoride IQ studies, and 64 of these have found a lowered IQ associated with higher fluoride exposure, and only 8 that have not found this association, or at least not a statistically significant association. Some other studies found an association, but it wasn't statistically significant. But an overwhelming preponderance of studies have had this, seen this effect where they've looked at it. The problem has been that people have not been looking at this in the fluoridated countries like the United States, Canada, England, Ireland, New Zealand and Australia. But more recently, the studies have been done in Canada, and there is one study in New Zealand which we will talk about. So on our webpage, fluoridealert.org, you will find a summary of the 60, actually it's 64, you can hardly keep up with the number of studies, 64. And my wife has gone through these 64 studies and described each study, linked to each study, made the whole study available where copyright allows. So you'll find that very useful. This is a gold mine of information on our website. I think we have the largest health database on fluoride in the world. And you have to ask the question, why is a citizens group, a non-profit organization, making available all this literature when governments are not doing it? That's a serious question that somebody in public health should be answering. Now, here are the key papers that I want to talk about. Some historical, but some very much in the last 3 years. So the first study I should be talking about is the Zhang study. Remember, we saw that picture of Guanyang Zhang a few slides ago. That's a very important study. The next study we should be talking about is a review of 27 IQ studies by a team, reviewed by a team from Harvard. It was a meta-analysis, and that included Philippe Grandjean, who's a world-renowned specialist in mercury's toxicology, neurotoxicology. Then the bombshell. This is the pivotal moment in the history of this issue. This was the study done in 2017 in Mexico City by Bashash and co-workers. That changed history of this whole debate. This study is the beginning of the end of fluoridation, or at least from a scientific point of view. Obviously, we can see the politics trying to keep this practice alive. More about that later. The next very important paper is 2019, which is essentially a replication of the Bashash study. These are both mother-offspring study, finding a relationship with between the exposure of the mother to fluoride and the lowered IQ of her offspring. So this is the first time, essentially, that we have seen the most sensitive life period is the fetal stage. It's the fetal stage which is, the fetus is the most sensitive to fluoride's neurotoxicity, which is very serious. Then we have another study in 2020, again from Canada, and this deals with bottle feeding, how you can see a difference in the IQ of children between children who are bottle fed in a fluoridated community in Canada and children who are bottle fed in a non-fluoridated community. Another bombshell study. Now, in addition to the IQ studies, oh, by the way, then we have a review by the National Toxicology Program. This is a big research agency in the United States. More about that later. And then another review by Philippe Grandjean, who I've mentioned already. That's very important for any scientist looking at this video. And now, another issue where fluoride interferes with cognition, human cognition, and that is the ADHD studies. Malin in 2015, Bashash in 2018, and Riddle in 2019. Again, particularly the Riddle study is another bombshell, but I'll leave the details till later. And then yet another study which may or may not pertain to the brain as such, but there is a study from Malin, who now works at Mount Sinai, which shows the disturbance of sleep patterns in adolescence, which is related to exposure to fluoride. Okay, so now I will talk in more detail about the fluoride and IQ studies. And that's when the National Research Council produced this 500-page review of fluoride's toxicology. It was the most balanced review that's ever been done on fluoride. I had the privilege of being the only anti-fluoride scientist to give testimony to them, and they incorporated much of my testimony in their review. So that too was a big moment for us. But again, unfortunately, winning scientifically does not mean you win politically. Largely ignored. Now, what they said about the brain, and they had a chapter on the brain, it is apparent that fluorides have the ability to interfere with the functions of the brain. They looked at both animal studies and human studies. But they only had 5 IQ studies available at that time. And one of those studies was this study by Guanyang Zhang. Now, I want you to see how the National Health and Medical Research Council, which is a federal agency, part of the federal government, This is what they did with Zhang. I want you to really look at this, absorb it, because then I want to show you the significance of the paper. They said full paper excluded, wrong intervention, no low or optimal fluoride group, final status excluded. Now when this NHMRC report came out, there were 2 volumes. The first volume was the narrative, and the second volume was all the studies that they excluded, which was thicker than the first volume. But this was one that was excluded, which annoyed me enormously. Another thing which was annoying, this study came out in 2007. This is 1 year after the NRC had spent 3.5 years doing this excellent review of all the toxicology. They handled that with 1 sentence. They just said this sentence. They said, in addition to the study, there have been other studies. They referred to a World Health Organization pamphlet, and they referred to this study, the NRC, and they said, however, the levels at which they were concerned was 2 to 4 parts per million, and in Australia we fluoridate at much lower levels. And that was it. They didn't take advantage of anything in that report. Really poor. And especially it betrayed a lack of toxicological understanding. For the sake of argument, supposing a study at 4 parts per million had found harm, and you were fluoridating at 1 part per million, there is no adequate margin of safety to allow you to ignore that 4 parts per million, for a variety of reasons. And one reason is that concentration is not the same as dose. So someone consuming a lot of water at 1 part per million could easily get a higher dose than someone consuming a little water, 4 parts per million. So you can't dismiss this as a study based upon concentration. However, let's go on. Now let's look at the Zhang study then. They compared the IQ of children in 2 villages. I visited those villages. The low fluoride village, where the average was 0.36 parts per million, the range was 0.18 to 0.76. How can the NHMRC, they'll say there was no control, there was no low or normal community. That overlaps with 0.7. We use 0.7 in Canada and the United States. I think you're 0.85. And the high fluoride village was 2.5 parts per million. Again, the range overlaps the levels used in Australia. They control for lead exposure and iodine intake, both of which can interfere with mental development. You have to exclude those. And arsenic. They found a drop of 5 to 10 IQ points across the whole age range between the 2 villages. And you can see how systematically the IQ curves were shifted down. So that if you look to the right here, you've got fewer people with high IQs. You see that on the right? You're looking at IQs 120, 130. The 130 is very bright kids. Fewer in that category. And over here, you've got more children. The magenta curve is the high fluoride village. More children who are less than 70 mentally handicapped. That shift is very important. We'll come back to that shift later on. But they did something even more important. The Waimeo was the high fluoride village. And notice they subdivided that into 5 groups with different fluoride concentrations in their water. 0.75, 1.5, 2.5, 3.3, 4 point something. And then over here is the average IQ in all those groups as you go up. And you see it starts with there's hardly much difference between them and the low fluoride village. But as you increase the water concentrations, the average IQ drops as you go down. And then they did something else. Oh, there's the curve. You plot this curve. So looking at this curve, excluding anything else, you would say IQ would be lowered in this experiment somewhere between 0.75 and 1.5. So this is saying that the IQ is lowered at the levels at which you fluoridate in Australia, and yet this has been excluded by the NHMRC. Now they did a second thing. They looked at the percentage of children in each of these groups who had an IQ less than 80. IQ of 80 to 70 means borderline mentally handicapped. Less than 70 is mentally handicapped. So the fraction in this group is very significant. Look how it rises. In this group, 9.5%, 14%, 21%, 37% of the children have been shifted into this mentally handicapped area. And again, you can plot this out. The higher the fluoride concentration in the water, the higher the fraction of children who are in the mentally handicapped area. Now, by 2010, the number of studies has gone up to 23 IQ studies. Again, China, India, Iran, and Mexico. And we had increased that number because we translated many of the Chinese studies that hadn't been available. That's why the number gets jacked up here. And in our book, this book, I wrote with two other professors, we have 80 pages of references in here, including all the references to all the IQ studies, these 23 studies. Okay. Now, the next turning point is 2012, where this issue goes beyond fluoride activists and Chinese researchers. This is when a team from Harvard, including Philippe Grandjean, published a meta-analysis of 27 of these IQ studies, many, incidentally, of the ones that we had translated from Chinese. And these included 25 studies from China and 2 from Iran. And it was published in Environmental Health Perspectives, which is one of the leading environmental health journals in the world. It is the house journal of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, which is the research body for the National Institute of Health, which promotes fluoridation. So this, within the system, we have this major publication, this review. Now what they found is that there were weaknesses in many of these studies. They didn't have all the information that they needed. All the confounders, were the confounders controlled? However, what they said is the results were remarkably consistent. Out of the 27 studies, 26 of them showed a lowering of IQ. And considering that these, with the average lowering, by the way, average lowering was 7 IQ points, which is significant. Now, highly significant from a social point of view. Considering that these studies were done over a period of 20 years, done by different research teams from different universities in different geographical locations in China, to get a consistency like that is quite extraordinary, which the authors acknowledged. And they said there was not an obvious confounding variable that they could see that could possibly explain such a consistency. Here are all the 20 studies. Here are all the 20 studies. You can see they go from 1991, I think it is, all the way down to wherever, 20 years worth. And if you take all the average of all those studies, there's this figure down here is minus 0.45. What is that? It's half a standard deviation. The difference in IQ is half a standard deviation. The proponents of fluoridation ran around saying, oh, it was only half an IQ point. It wasn't half an IQ point, it was half a standard deviation, which translates to 7 IQ points. There's a big difference between half an IQ point and 7 IQ points. Again, a little bit of, maybe it's an accident, but a little bit of politics may be coming in there. And then this included, by the way, there it is, there's Zhang over there. We've talked about that already. All right. Now, confronted with this body of evidence, whilst it's causing ripple effect amongst activists around the world, the proponents of fluoridation have focused on one study to negate all these studies. And that is a study done in New Zealand by Broadbent in 2014. So let's have a look at that study. It's fatally flawed, in my view. there were very few controls. There were 991 of the kids in this study lived in a fluoridated area when they were growing up, and only 99 in non-fluoridated. Moreover, Broadbent only looked at the exposure from fluoridated water and ignored the possible and probable exposure from other things like supplements. Most of the kids in New Zealand that weren't on fluoridated water at that time were given supplements. So by the time you subtract those kids, there's very little difference in the fluoride intake between the two groups, and so the study lacked any power. Further complicating this is that New Zealand is one of the biggest tea drinkers at that time in the world, and tea is a big source of fluoride. So if you're concerned about this issue, don't drink so much tea here. Okay, mix it. Have coffee, chamomile, all those other things, herbal teas. Okay, now we could argue about the quality of this study, and people have. The NHMRC, however, I thought it was a poor study, but this is now 2017, okay? Basically in 2017 they regurgitated the 2007 study, and here's the details. This was published in July of 2017. 2017, important year, July. And what did they say? Well, they only referenced 15 now of the 50 IQ studies. They didn't refer to the Harvard meta-analysis. Again, they ignored Zhang of 2003, even though people like myself wrote a stinging critique of the NHMRC 2000 study. And they gave Broadbent a high quality rating and a low risk of bias. And this was key to their conclusion. Their conclusion, the evidence from a single study of acceptable quality, meaning Broadbent, shows that there is no association between water fluoridation at current Australian levels and the cognitive function of children or adults. Well, that's so that you know, they are putting the weight on the study, which I consider is a lousy study, and I don't know, and I haven't got it here. But later on, when the NTP review came out, they reviewed all the studies and they gave Broadbent a low quality study, a high risk of bias to their study. So they agree with us. Anyway, this is all moot, because on September the 19th, and it's all moot in terms of using Broadbent to negate all the Chinese, etc. studies, because on the 19th of September came the bombshell, and the bombshell was Bashash 2017. Again, this was published in Environmental Health Perspectives. It was a prenatal study, one of the first to look at the fetus exposed to fluoride as opposed to the child. I mean, right up to this point, when we see a lowered IQ of the children, we don't know if it's IQ being lowered whilst they were infants, bottle feeding, or whether it's IQ lowered during pregnancy, when they're in the womb. We didn't know. This is the first time that anybody had set out to look at that. So it's a 12-year study. It's a multi-million-dollar study, and it's funded by US government agencies, the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Institute of Health, and the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. Important. The authors came from many prestigious institutions: University of Toronto, University of McGill, Harvard, Indiana, Michigan, Mount Sinai, and a Mexican institute. What did they do? They examined approximately 300 mother-offspring pairs. So you measure something in the mother and you measure something in the offspring, and they're linked, they're pairs of data. Both exposure and outcomes were determined on an individual basis. All the studies before this point had been measuring communities, the level of community in the fluoride, the level in the water of the group, and the level of the water of the control. Comparing communities. These are called ecological studies, and they have the lowest weight from epidemiological point of view. What we have here are individual based measurements, and the mother's exposure to fluoride during pregnancy was determined via their urine levels. Now that's incredibly important because there are many sources of fluoride out there. Tea, water if you're fluoridated or if it's natural, food, some foods are high in fluoride, any food with bones in it is going to be high in fluoride, and fluoridated water, fluoridated salt is used in Mexico. This study was done in Mexico City. But the level of fluoride in the urine gives you a total measure of the woman's exposure to fluoride. So it doesn't matter if she got the fluoride from water or from toothpaste or anything else. Total exposure. That's our measurement of one data point.
How does it come out in the urine? Is it like calcium fluoride, or is it something?
It's fluoride ion. Once the fluoride is in water, anything like calcium fluoride, sodium fluoride is irrelevant, because in water an ionic substance splits up into the separate ions. Positive. They don't know each other. It's just like, say you've got sodium chloride, salt. As far as the chemist is concerned, a solution of sodium chloride is two chemicals. You've got sodium ions free in water and chloride ions in free water. Totally separate chemistries. You can study them separately, you can test for them separately. And the sodium ions and sodium chloride will be identical to the sodium ions and sodium fluoride. So yes, what you measure in the urine is free fluoride ions with a fluoride sensitive electrode. Notice they controlled for all the variables that the Chinese studies were criticized for not controlling for all these variables. It's extremely difficult in epidemiology to get two communities which are similar in every characteristic. It's very difficult. So you have to control for these different things so that you really are looking at the one thing that you're examining, which in this case is fluoride and the outcome. Okay. Now, they looked at the IQ of these women's offspring at the age of 4 and again at 6 to 12. And what they found is that for every 1 milligram per liter increase in the concentration in the woman's urine, there was a 5 to 6 IQ point drop in those offspring matched pairs. You'll see the significance of that in a moment. Well, here we are. Now, see the bottom, that is the maternal urine fluoride, the level of fluoride in the mother's urine. And that blue area, that blue bracket, is the range of mother's urine levels in the United States. That's the range. Over here, the red bracket, if you go across to the curve, shows you what the IQ drop. And that's the 5 to 6 IQ point drop. In other words, for the expected range in the United States, the IQ drop would be 5 to 6 IQ points. So what we're looking at here is a top-class study looking at effects which correspond to what we're exposed to in the United States. Oh. Now they criticize. Oh, well, you'll see the criticism in a moment. This is their conclusion. In this study, higher levels of maternal urinary fluoride during pregnancy are proxy for prenatal fluoride exposure that are in the range of levels of exposure in other general population samples of pregnant women, as well as non-pregnant adults, were associated with the lower scores on tests of cognitive function in the offspring at 4 and 6 to 12 years of age. Devastating study. Got very little media attention. And this is what the American Dental Association said in an interview 1 minute after it was published. In other words, they were ready with their press release. They'd obviously got a pre-copy, so they're ready with their press release. And when the journalist goes out to get comments from them, they're ready with it. And here's the comment from the American Dental Association. The American Dental Association examined a study in environmental health perspectives based on fluoride intake in Mexico and concludes the findings are not applicable to the United States. The ADA continues to endorse fluoridation of public water as the most effective public health measure to prevent tooth decay. We've seen statements like that coming out from the ADA for the past 50 years. It doesn't matter what the study is, it's always the same. This is what the author, the prime author, the guy that heads up the study of this particular cohort, which has been investigated for over 20 years, Howard Hugh. Remember that name. Many of the experts here are going to be working for us or testifying in our court case. He's one of them. Okay. He said he was interviewed in the same article in the Toronto newspaper. This is a very rigorous epidemiological study. You just can't deny it. It's directly related to whether fluoride is a risk to the neurodevelopment of children. To say it has no relevance to the folks in the United States seems disingenuous. How gentle scientists can be. Okay, so I could tell you about a study that was done within a few months in Canada which showed that the average level in the urine of pregnant women in fluoridated communities in Canada was almost identical to the level in the Mexico City study. So within a few months, that ADA conclusion was thrown out. But more importantly, the Bashash study was essentially replicated with one significant difference in Canada. This is a study by Green and co-workers, and it was published in one of the world's leading journals of pediatrics, JAMA Pediatrics. As I said, they essentially reproduce the same methodology, the association between mothers' urine levels during pregnancy and IQ scores in the offspring. If anything, their methodology was stronger. They learned from some of the criticisms of Bashash to do it even better. What did they find? Oh, again, this was funded by the NIH, government agency, US. They found a large statistically significant effects on IQ, but the average loss of IQ, as far as the maternal exposure was concerned, was only in boys, not girls. Now, the authors offered some explanation of why that might have been, but nevertheless, the pro-fluoridation people have latched onto the fact that it was only boys to try to discredit the whole studies. But meanwhile, the authors not only looked at a relationship between maternal exposure, the mother's urine level, but they looked at the exposure of the mother in the communities where they were living. So they looked at mother's ingestion, the total fluoride, this graph here, the total fluoride intake in milligrams per day. And with that measurement, they found a drop of IQ for both the boys and the girls. And it's possible, I'm not saying this is sure, but it's possible that boys are more sensitive in the womb, but girls are sensitive once they're born. Well, that's yet to be resolved. And JAMA Pediatrics, this important article was refused by other journals because it was too controversial. And JAMA, knowing how controversial this would be, they doubled up the amount of peer review. They had people go through the statistical analysis twice just to make sure that they hadn't made any obvious mistakes. And in addition, when they published it, they published a short editorial explaining the steps they took to make sure this was peer-reviewed properly. They carried an article by David Bellinger, one of the world's experts on lead neurotoxicity, and they put out a podcast of the editor of JAMA's Total and the editor of JAMA Pediatrics talking about this study. If I had more time, I could show you excerpts of this, but you can go to our webpage and listen to it. Basically what they're saying, boy, I thought that fluoridation was one of the best things since sliced bread. That's what I was always told. It was perfectly safe. But look at this. And they're shocked. They're obviously shocked. And one of the conclusions is they advised pregnant women. They said, one of them said, if my wife was pregnant, I'd advise her not to drink fluoridated water. Now, unlike Bashash, this received massive public media attention. Not the New York Times, they've yet to cover it, but massive media attention around the world. JAMA Pediatrics distributed the study widely, and unfortunately that meant that the pro-fluoridation people had time to round up a number of experts to attack this paper. we have since shown that most of their criticism, if not all their criticisms, do not hold water. One of the big criticisms, this is only one study. Only one study? This is ridiculous. I told you how many studies there are. And so on. Anyway, we've got Andrew has prepared a summary of all the responses to those critiques if this becomes an issue in any of your discussions with others. Before I go further, I want to explain the huge significance of the loss of IQ at the population level, not at the individual level. It could be critical for some individuals, depending upon where they are on this curve. But for the population, it is critical. And I'd like to explain it with this diagram. That is a normal distribution curve, the famous bell-shaped curve. IQ is in the bottom axis, and the area under the curve represents the number of children with a particular IQ value. So, with that said, the two areas under the curve which are particularly significant, I'd already referred to this when I talked about Zhang. Those above 130, and the area under the curve is that green area represents the fraction of children in your population who are very bright. It would include geniuses, that green area. And that magenta area is IQ less than 70. Those are all the mentally handicapped. Now, if you were to shift the curve down by 5 IQ points, or thereabouts, this is what happens. The average person goes from 100 to 95, and a parent wouldn't notice. If a parent had two siblings and you had an IQ of 100 and you had 95, your parent wouldn't know it. The school teacher wouldn't be able to spot it. But look what happens to the two tails here. Look what happens to the very bright. You have halved the number of very bright kids in your society. Huge economic ramifications in this global economy. And look over here, you've increased, the exact number is you've increased by 57% the number of intellectually impaired. Again, that has huge social and economic implications. So what you do to your population is very, very serious. And this is a measure which is designed to reach the whole population of your children, the whole population. This isn't like any medicine where it only impacts a few people that might be critically ill and they need something to cure cancer. Then you take risks. But here is a risk that you're imposing on the whole population. Okay. Another bombshell. 2020, just a few months ago, Christine Teal, Canadian researcher, and this is what they found. They looked at the difference in IQ of children who had been bottle-fed in fluoridated communities compared to children who were bottle-fed in non-fluoridated communities in Canada. The only difference was that all the kids were bottle-fed. One had the parents were using tap water, fluoridated tap water to make up the formula, and non-fluoridated tap water. You wouldn't, what kind of IQ drop would you expect? My God. 9 IQ points on the full scale IQ for each 1 milligram per litre increase in tap water. 9 IQ points. And then if you look at performance scale IQ, which is non-verbal, it's called performance scale, non-verbal. 19 IQ points. I mean, these numbers, most people would disbelieve that this study, and I'm sure they're trying now to destroy this study, but it's a bombshell. So now we've got evidence that in the womb, the brain is damaged, and now as an infant it's damaged. And here's the recommendation from the authors. After adjusting for fetal exposure, they adjusted for fetal exposure. So now we're looking separate from fetal. We found that fluoride exposure during infancy predicts diminished nonverbal intelligence, In the absence of any benefit from fluoride consumption in the first 6 months, it is prudent to limit fluoride exposure by using non-fluoridated water or water with lower fluoride content as a formula. Needless to say, no agency in Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, or any fluoridated country has attempted to get this warning to parents about bottle feeding their kids. Meanwhile, they've not warned pregnant women that there's any problem. Now, this goes back to one of the first things I discovered when I was reading the literature in 1996, when my wife persuaded me to get involved in it. The level of fluoride in mother's milk is incredibly low. And I said at the time, my goodness, nature doesn't make many mistakes. If fluoride was necessary for baby's development, whether it's teeth, bones, or whatever, that's where you expect to find it. And you don't find it. It's very, very low. And so I argue that mother's milk protects the infant from fluoride, and when you fluoridate, you remove that protection. The level in, if you bottle feed, it's between 175, well, it depends where you fluoridate. Supposing you fluoridate at 1 part per million, it's 250 times higher. So I've been saying that. You've heard my talk so many times. I've been saying this now for 20 odd years in my presentations. And now I'm talking to you just a couple of months after the study that we feared most has been published, that there's a dramatic difference on the IQ of the kids. Okay, so now look at ADHD, where the results are even more striking. A little bit of history. Back in 2015, Malin and Till, this is the same Till as the last paper, they did this study. They looked at the prevalence of ADHD by state in the United States, by state, the 50 states. And the indices that they measured was the percentage of the state fluoridated. So at the bottom you've got the order of the states in terms of how much of their water is fluoridated throughout the state. And look what happens to the prevalence of ADHD. They did this for 3 years worth of data. They did it for data from 2003, 2007, 2011. And what you find in each case is the prevalence of ADHD increases by state as the percentage of the state fluoridated increases. Well, that's again the proponents attack this study. Then Bashash, remember Bashash 2017 from Mexico State, the same cohort, they looked at attention deficit syndrome. So in addition to looking at IQ, they looked at ADHD. And sure enough, they found an increase in ADHD as the mother's exposure went up. Another good quality study. And then another bombshell, you ready? 2019, another Canadian study, another study funded by the NIH. What did they do? They looked at the prevalence of ADHD in fluoridated communities in Canada versus non-fluoridated. And they found nearly 3 times, 2.84 to be precise, but nearly 300% higher risk of ADHD for those living in fluoridated areas in Canada compared to non-fluoridated. And for each milligram per litre increase of fluoride in the tap water, a 600% increase in ADHD. It's hard. I mean, we were staggered by these results. We thought there would be, increases, but we had no idea it was as powerful as that. And what this underlines, incidentally, and the same thing is with the virus right now, the absence of study does not mean the absence of harm. So Trump says there's no problem with the virus, and we did a few weeks ago. I think he's changed his mind now. There's no problem. But what he didn't mention is there were hardly any tests being done for the virus in Canada a couple of weeks ago. And so you can't assume that the absence of study is the same as absence of harm. And that's what's been assumed in Australia since you started fluoridation in the 60s and 70s. You just haven't done the studies here. You haven't done a single IQ study in Australia. You haven't done a single ADHD study in Australia. You've hardly done any studies. And they just repeat, it's safe and effective, safe and effective, safe and effective. I think the conclusion is obvious. And then finally this paper by Malin until she found, using nationally available data, that adolescents had a higher problems with sleeping in the fluoridated, with higher levels of fluoride in their drinking water than lower levels. This relates to fluoride possibly because there have been animal studies which shows that fluoride produces lowered melatonin production in animals, and lowered melatonin production obviously would affect sleep patterns. It's very little data, unfortunately, and there's been not much attempt to repeat the work done in England on that, particularly on the pineal gland. The NTP review in 2016, we at the Fluoride Action Network requested that the National Toxicology Program conduct a systematic review of fluoride's neurotoxicity. In today's world, you can have all these top-class studies, but unless someone has done a systematic review where they quantify the quality of each study and add it all up, it doesn't count. And that's the way NHMRC gets away with it. It's always they've done a systematic review, and all the harm that we thought was out there magically disappears. The draft came out late last year of this systematic review, after 3 years of work, and this was their conclusion. NTP concludes that fluoride is presumed, this is the second highest level of classification, the top one is a known neurotoxicant. Basically, it's a presumed, based upon the studies that are out there, you can presume that it's a neurotoxicant. This conclusion is based upon a consistent pattern of findings in human studies across several different populations, showing that higher fluoride exposure is associated with decreased IQ or other cognitive impairments in children. Wow! We have finally been vindicated. After 24 years of concerns on this issue, we finally get the #1 agency in the United States for toxicology coming out and saying that. Short-lived. Oh, by the way, this is their Broadbent. They reviewed Broadbent. The orange areas indicate high risk of bias. Those three, and remember, NHMRC used Broadbent as the study which allowed them to say no problem. And now, March the 5th, just a few days ago, just before I came out here, I left on March the 7th, the National Academy of Sciences, a panel from the National Academy of Sciences, came out and said this NTP review has problems. They didn't follow their protocols, blah, 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 blah. They themselves analyzed the scientific review itself, the science itself, but just the way that the NTP quantified the quality of the different studies, etc. And they had more harsh things to say about the animal studies than the human studies. As far as we can tell, and we put out a press release on this, the substance of the NTP review has not been impacted. The substance is there, but what this represents for us is a heartbreaking delay in having this NTP finalized. The NTP has said that they're going to complete this they hope by the end of the year. Meanwhile, Philip Grandjean has written the ultimate review of fluoride. It's a very long paper, and if you're scientific or you know scientists, This is a terrific place to start because he's got chapter and verse for all the studies. Everything I've talked about is there in official language. None of my histrionics. And finally, this is really finally, we have the lawsuit. My son, who worked for us from 2000 to 2008, came to us in 2008, said, "Mum and Dad, I'm going to become a lawyer." He went to law school. Then he, after graduating and clerking for a couple of judges, he joined a tort firm in Los Angeles. And after getting his feet wet for a few years, he came back with this lawsuit. And it's a slightly different approach to what others have thought about. He's using the Toxic Substances and Control Act. Now that has a clause in that act which allows citizens to petition the mighty EPA. Petition the EPA to say, please ban the use of this particular substance for this particular use. And we said we want the EPA to ban the deliberate addition of fluoride chemicals to the drinking water. It says nothing about natural fluoride. And this didn't go to the water division, which has been promoting fluoridation for a long time. Went to a different division. The EPA came back and rejected our petition. But they made a huge tactical mistake. They rejected our petition based upon its scientific merits. They said these scientific studies there, no, you haven't proved anything with this science. It's beautiful because this allowed us now to go to federal court and argue the case. And so a federal judge now, believe it or not, will have the task of listening to the science from our side, which says this is a neurotoxic risk, an unnecessary, unreasonable risk, and then he will hear from the EPA's experts. By the way, they don't have any of their own experts. They've hired consultants that normally are doing similar things for industry. They don't have their own experts. Unbelievable. Anyway, we have many of the experts that are featured here. We have Bruce Lamphere, who's part of the TILS team. We have Philippe Grandjean. And we have Howard Hugh, who was part of the Bashash study. So we have the best experts in the world to testify on our side. And the case will be heard in April of 2020. It starts April the 20th. I go from New Zealand to Los Angeles, then I go to San Francisco, join my wife, and we're going to look at our son, try to win this case. Unless the bloody virus hits us. Finally, after having to deal with the NHMRC, we finally get knocked out by the virus. Isn't that ironic? Anyway, you can read about our lawsuit on our webpage along with everything else. The conclusions: for any community to continue fluoridation with all these studies, including several US government-funded studies and a draft NTP review on the table, is reckless, in my view. And the risks to fetal and infant brain development far outweigh any benefit to the teeth from ingestion of fluoride during fetal and infant development. In fact, there are very, very few dentists or dental organizations that even claim now that the fetus is getting any dental benefit from exposure. So it shouldn't be difficult to win that case. And other countries have shown that these benefits can be secured by other means. You can, they've admitted that fluoride works topically. So if you want fluoride, you brush it on your teeth and spit out. And that's it. I wish Andrew to note that the time is exactly 1:30. I've done that in less than an hour. We started, I think, at about 25:02. So this is good news. Thank you for the practice.
Paul, was there a study in Europe that mapped Asperger's syndrome to fluoridated communities
Really? I've never seen that before.
I think it,
Dig it up for me.
I'll dig it up. It was published in Czechoslovakia, but it's published in English.
I'd be interested to see
yeah.
that. You're saying there's more Asperger's syndrome?
That yes, it was more prevalent in communities in Europe than unfluoridated communities.
Wow. No, I've never. That's news to me. That's news to me. Wow.
Are there any other questions?
Can you tell me, what is the political establishment scared of if we stop fluoridating water? Surely it seems there's more to it than just tooth decay. I mean, what is it that's going on at that high political level where they just refuse to acknowledge the data?
Charles, you've asked the $64,000 question. It's a $64,000 question. I've struggled for 24 years, and basically what you're asking is there a rational explanation for irrational behavior? Because this practice now is absurdly irrational. So what is driving it? There are financial interests.
Vested interests.
Yeah, there are invested. The phosphate fertilizer industry takes a hazardous waste which costs them a lot of money to get rid of officially, and they make money being paid to take it. So they have a financial interest. In the United States, that amounts to between $100 and $200 million a year. That's certainly enough to fund lobbies to continue this practice, but I don't think it's enough to really be pulling the tail of the whole establishment. And so you have to look for something else. Now, I'm going to take a little bit of time to get to the answer. Okay. The first thing is to say, historically, fluoridation made dentistry a part of the health program. This fluoridation for dentistry is their contribution to public health. They got their prestige and a lot of funding based upon this whole research effort around fluoridation. And even today, if you want to get money for research, then you declare it's something to do with fluoridation, either dental fluorosis or dental caries or what have you. You should also notice three dates. 1945 is when the trials began in the United States. 1945, Grand Rapids. 1950 is when the US Public Health Service endorsed fluoridation before any of these trials had been completed. The trials were incomplete, they had no health studies of any significance, and yet the US Public Health Service endorses it. What has happened in between? Well, one of the things which has happened in between is they built the National Institute of Dental Research. This is a huge building in Bethesda, Maryland, which is like symbolic of where dentistry is now. It was once thought of as plumbing. You went to the plumber, he did this, that, and the other, he did teeth. But now they are getting big money for research from the National Institute of Health. National Institute is part of the National Institute of Health. So what I'm trying to say is there's a huge amount of pride amongst the dental establishment, the dental community. And they've been fighting for this since it was started. If you go back in history, there have been ding-dong battles which have been going on in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, all the way to the present. And it's become almost a game. Almost a game. Two sides fighting it, slugging it out, insulting each other, blah, 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 blah. And endorsements. As I said, the US Public Health Service endorsed it in 1950. Immediately, within the next 2 years, all the professional bodies essentially to do with health and dentistry in the United States followed suit. They also endorsed fluoridation, again with no science on the table. So it was political then. But what has happened, it fossilized this practice, it entrenched this practice. And you can see, and I've discussed this in the book, you can see the shift from the notion that we should continue to investigate health effects to outright promotion of fluoridation. For example, the Centre of Disease Control, which is a body of 30,000 people, you often hear that the CDC says that fluoridation is one of the top 10 public health achievements of the 20th century. It's quoted somewhere everywhere. There's only one entity at the CDC that deals with fluoride, and that's the Oral Health Division. This is 30 people. They're all dentists or dentally trained people. There's no toxicologists in there. They don't take any responsibility for the toxicology. They refer you to other agencies. They continue to promote. So they have a huge conflict of interest promoting fluoridation, and yet many people see them as, oh, they must know what they're doing. No, they don't. Now you look at the more general phenomena, bureaucracies. If you work in a bureaucracy, in the middle of a bureaucracy, you know that your job is to promote policy. If you begin to question policy, you don't make it, you don't get that promotion, and you're risking your future. So this knocks out a lot of intelligent people who are there, who see their job as promotion and not questioning. Now the guy at the very top is a political appointment, so he's not going to question the existence of his huge salary now. And then you've got all the people at the bottom. And all the people at the bottom are the dentists and the doctors. They've all been only taught one thing at dental school. Well, actually, they're taught two things at dental school. One, that fluoridation is the best thing since sliced bread. And two, the people opposed to fluoridation are Looney Tunes. That's what they think. And once they've left dental school, what happens? They get a practice. They're incredibly busy. The amount of literature they can read has to be limited, probably limited to their speciality. So they have to do what? They take the word of the professional bodies, the ADA and the AMA, and they've been locked into this, and they've got the same bureaucratic structures. So the answer is, and one of those big bodies which is pro-fluoridation is the public health community. And what is the public health community frightened of? They are frightened of this. If the public health community loses fluoridation, it loses credibility. If they lose credibility, they lose the public's trust. And if you're in public health, that's the worst thing that could happen to you in public health. If you're in public health and you're doing a measure for everyone, like fluoridation, you have to have total confidence when you go to the public. It is safe and effective. There is no evidence of any harm. And if they admit any possibility of harm, the program is over. But what I think, they're frightened of losing other public health practices. For example, fluoridation from a financial point of view is not worth a hill of beans. The amount of saving is so small. It's not worth much. But there are other public health programs which are worth billions of dollars. And one of those includes vaccination.
So they're worried about taking a leg away and the whole lot's going to come
Yeah, that's right. And that's worth billions. So I think basically you're seeing maybe other public health practices that fluoridation is a proxy for defending other public health practices. That to me is the most rational explanation. You've also got the toothpaste manufacturers, people that are using fluoride. I think they are worried that if we show that it's lowering IQ, it's going to have a huge impact on a multi-billion-dollar industry. But Charles, it's a tough one. It's a tough one to answer.
It'll take a very brave political party to just change it, to admit they're wrong.
Yes, it's very difficult in public. But my message to them is, yes, it may be difficult, but you improve your credibility when you admit a past mistake. You improve it.
I was also interested in what you had to say about children's development in schools now.
Yeah.
I mean, I talk to a lot of educators around the place, and only anecdotally, but it seems like every class now has difficult children with ADHD. 30, 40 years ago when I was at school, it just wasn't around.
No.
Now we have these problem children in every class.
It's exploding.
In every school.
Yeah.
It's exploding.
Yeah. In fact, you know, Andrew, I haven't spoken to you about this, or John and Bev, but you know, we keep focusing on the medical community and the Ministry of Health, but we should be talking to the Ministry of Education. It's the educators that need to hear this because of.
Yeah.
By the way, the purpose of this trip, hopefully, is I think we've got such a strong scientific case, but we have very few scientists who are involved in this issue. They, like everybody else, they're scared off. Everybody's frightened to be labelled Looney Tunes. I know I was, and other people too. We've got to get more scientists involved, because as long as it's these wonderful citizens who persevere year after year after year of fighting this thing, as long as the other side is unscrupulous in the way that they attack, and so citizens don't count in terms of the ultimate influence. They count if we have huge numbers. We know that politically. But when you've got a few people, it's difficult to prevail in terms politically. But if those few people were 20 doctors and 10 PhDs, and the letters which were going to government agencies were being signed by, or to the media, were being signed by them, or full-page ads. If we ever got to the point of having a millionaire supporting us, we could run full-page ads spelling out the science, but also signed by prominent scientists and MDs. We'd have a much better chance of winning this. The trouble is the average person doesn't know anything of what I've told you today, because the media is not covering it. And if the media doesn't cover it, it doesn't happen. In the United States, if the New York Times doesn't cover a scientific study, it hasn't happened. It's sad, but true. And the editor, then there's one more little juicy morsel here, little juicy historical morsel. The science editor of the New York Times is the son, he's McNeil, his name is McNeil, he's the son of Donald McNeil, who wrote the book on the history of fluoridation and the victory of fluoridation. He was a die-in-our-heart fluoride promoter. He wrote the book on it. And his son is quoted, his son, the current science editor of the New York Times, said, "This issue was resolved years ago." Which doesn't say much for as a scientist, because no scientific issue is ever resolved. And the notion that you had powerful science in the 1950s, 60s or 70s, no, it's ridiculous, but okay. So you've seen what I've said. We've got science and we've got denial. We've got science and we've got politics. And we've got science and all those other difficult factors. But we have you. People with an open mind. Does anybody know any professors of science, any biochemists, any chemists, any neuroscientists, any psychologists?
Psychologists, yes.
What's that?
Psychologists, yes.
Yes, well we need to.
And physiotherapists, being a physio myself.
Oh yeah.
And I must say I'm quite pleasantly surprised that with petitions and things that we've had, various places that I work along would be very happy to sign this.
Yeah. Well, we need scientists to read the literature. And what I fear, going back to this virus, what I fear is, I think I've said it, but I've said it a different way. With this issue, we've driven a wedge between honest science and public health policy, and that's a bad thing to do because of the loss of public's trust when they find out. And then when you need the public's trust, it won't be there. And we need it right now with this virus.
Very good.
Okay,
That's
well,
fantastic.
I think that's so nice of you to show up and get educated. And Elisa, thank you for videotaping, because let people know if they didn't come today, they can watch this from the safety of their own homes.
Well, what you like about the Catherine O'Leary, she's the health editor of the West Australian newspaper.
Yeah.
I mean, she's said, well, Anti-Fluoridation Institute grouped them all together with the flat earthers.
I know. That's a tactic. It's just a PR tactic.
Yeah.
A PR tactic. It's such sloppy thinking. It's such sloppy thinking. But it just shows you what I learned with my other campaign with waste. What the other side, your opponent, needs to do is to put you in a box, give you a label, one sentence. Once they put you in a box, all the time that you've spent on this, the books that you've written, the presentations you've made, count for nothing. If they've got the right sentence to use when your name comes up, all that is flushed down the toilet. I'll tell you a funny story, if you have time. I don't want to hold you up, because this is not serious, it's funny. When I first started on fighting incineration, the leading opponent was Dr. Barry Commoner. And what did they say about Commoner? Well, he's not really a scientist, he's a politician, he's run for president. So, okay, so all of Barry Commoner's work gets in the box. He's not a scientist, he's a politician. And then other people that were fighting incineration, well, he's being paid for this, he's a consultant, he's a hired gun. Now, I was not a politician, I was a professor, I was not being paid to do these talks on fighting incineration. What box are they going to put me in? What are they going to say about me to put me in a box? And it came back to me after a year or two. You know what they're saying about you? You are an environmental evangelist. Well, I said, well, I know that's not too bad. I think the environment needs some evangelism. But then the next thing that came back was I was the Jimmy Swaggart of trash. Now, Jimmy Swaggart was one of these Bible-punching TV evangelists. And then, one day, I don't know whether I was in the shower or where I was, it came to me, this phrase, God recycles, the devil burns. So I was equipped. I was waiting for when somebody said I was an evangelist. That's right, that's right. God recycles, the devil burns.
Fantastic.
And when I finally met the Pope and gave him my book on waste and shook his hand, I forgot to say that. Hey,
Excellent.
great, thanks very much.
Thank you.
It's great to meet you. Thank you for
Good
that.
to meet you.